Step out of the vehicle right now, Ray. Holden shouted, his gun aimed straight at the black man who had just opened the door under the blazing midday sun. Malcolm Vance looked up, sunlight flashing off the gold badge gleaming against his purple suit. You just pointed at a gun at your superior officer. The entire street froze. His gun hit the ground, and the man who had shouted now knelt before the very justice he had once disrespected. One arrogant second cost him his entire career, because justice doesn't need to yell, it acts. If that moment unfolded right in front of you, how would you react? What state are you in? At midday, Hawthorne Street blazed under a harsh white light. Heat shimmered off the pavement like a thin layer of smoke, blurring the figures rushing across the intersection. The city's sounds merged into the thick air, car horns, tires screeching on asphalt, radio static from a roadside shop. A sleek black sedan came to a stop at the red light, its window reflecting half of Malcolm Vance's face, a black man with sharp features, calm, deep eyes. He held a folder on his lap, fingers lightly flipping through each page as if reviewing a final report before a meeting. The sunlight glinted off a round gold badge by his chest pocket, then disappeared beneath the fold of a dark purple suit. Across the street, a police cruiser pulled up diagonally, door flung open, the sound of boots hitting the pavement rang out like metal on metal. Ray Holden, a tall, broad-shouldered patrol officer in the downtown district, stepped out and gave a half smirk at the sight of the luxury car in the crowded lane. He approached, rapping his knuckles hard on the window, eyes scanning Malcolm from head to toe. "Nice car. You rent it or steal it?" His dry voice cut through the city noise, drawing a few heads nearby. Malcolm looked up, lowered the window, slightly squinting against the glare. His voice was low, steady, and clear. "I think you're talking to the wrong person." Their eyes met, one cold as steel, the other flickering with pride. Holden tilted his head, smirked again. "In this neighborhood, someone like you is never the right person." He emphasized each word like he was trying to carve them into the air. Malcolm set the folder on the passenger seat, removed his sunglasses, and his eyes lit up in the sun. "And what kind of person would that be?" Holden shot back instantly. "The kind who thinks he's above the law just because he wears a suit and drives something expensive." Malcolm leaned back slightly, light slicing across his face in a sharp contrast of brightness and shadow. "I'm driving my own car in the correct lane, breaking no laws. So what exactly are you stopping me for?" Holden took a breath, hand resting on his belt near the holster, voice slow but sharp. "Because I have the right to be suspicious, and you make me suspicious." He leaned in, close, his face just inches from Malcolm's hot breath, fogging the glass. In that moment, Malcolm didn't flinch, his gaze fixed on Holden's police badge where the words "to serve and protect" gleamed under the blinding sunlight. "That phrase means serve and protect, doesn't it?" Malcolm said quietly, his tone so even it bordered on calm. "Are you doing both right now?" Holden stood upright, the corner of his mouth twitching into a restrained smile that looked less like amusement and more like an act of control. He slammed his hand on the roof of the car. "Step out, now. I want to check your papers and the vehicle." Malcolm exhaled slowly, his eyes glancing at the rearview mirror. A line of cars had stopped behind them. A few people in the corner cafe were turning to look, and a woman had already pulled out her phone, the camera pointed straight at them. "Can you state a valid reason for this check?" Malcolm asked, his tone steady and even. "You look suspicious," Holden replied flatly, a flicker of smugness flashing in his eyes. "In this part of town, someone like you could be checked 10 times and it still wouldn't be enough." Malcolm opened the door and stepped out, not rushed, not afraid. The sunlight tore through the air, casting their stretched shadows across the pavement. He brushed his cuff with a calm motion, then looked the officer square in the face. "What exactly do you expect to find on a man heading to work at noon?" Holden squinted, his voice rougher now. Could be evidence, could just be attitude, Malcolm replied, or it could be a big mistake. Holden raised an eyebrow and stepped in close, the smell of smoke and leather pouring off his uniform. You trying to teach me how to do my job? Malcolm shook his head. No, I'm reminding you where power ends. The words dropped into the space between them like a thin blade. A faint breeze passed by, carrying the distant sound of a car horn. Holden looked around and noticed the eyes watching. He tried to keep his voice cold. Limits, huh? Around here, I am the limit. Malcolm looked at him, the light catching in his eyes like a flicker of flame. No, you're its test. Between them, the air pulled tight, silent enough to hear the scrape of a shoe against the ground. Holden smirked and took half a step back, but his voice stayed sharp. I'll remember your face, Malcolm answered softly. You'll remember more than that. The traffic light turned green and the cars behind honked loudly, but amid the moving crowd, the two figures stood still. Holden stared at Malcolm for another second before turning away, his hand still resting on his holster like a silent reminder of who held the power. Malcolm returned to his seat, opened the door, placed the folder on his lap, and kept his gaze fixed on the mirror. In the rear view, the officer's figure faded into the burning white light. Malcolm spoke to himself barely more than a whisper, like a quiet forecast. Sometimes the ones who believe they're strongest are the ones about to shatter. The sedan rolled forward, melting into the slow-moving stream of cars through the intersection. In the distance, the light still burned harshly. But inside Malcolm, the heat wasn't from the sun. It came from something familiar, the instinct of someone who had seen too many wrongs wear the mask of authority. And he knew this midday encounter was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. Midday light on Hawthorne Street grew increasingly harsh, the pavement glinting like glass, reflecting patches of searing sunlight that distorted everything in sight. City sounds bounced between mirrored walls, echoing honking horns and the steady churn of engine. Malcolm Vance's sedan pulled up along the curb, and Holden, eyes locked like he'd found a target for the frustration boiling inside him, stepped forward, his voice sliding through the heat. Raise your hands. Let me see if they're dirty. The words sounded like a joke, but carried a bitter, dry sting that made a few bystanders flinch. Malcolm inhaled, lifted his chin to face the officer, his expression still as water, and slowly raised both hands, every motion so measured you could count his breaths. The only dirty thing here, he said, voice low and steady, is the way you're doing your job. The air paused. Holden stalled for a beat, then let out a sharp laugh, a half smile twisted in contempt. You think you're clever, or do you think that skin color gives you the right to talk back? The question came out like a blade, clean deep, cutting through the gathering crowd. Malcolm stood firm, shoulders unshaken, voice calibrated like from a ruler. I believe justice has no color. You just proved otherwise. A breeze swept by, brushing against the sun, bringing a strange stillness, as if the street itself had swallowed its sound. A nearby water vendor signaled customers to step back, while a girl in the corner cafe leaned toward the window phone, raised the screen, catching a flare of blue light. Holden curled his lip. His breath quickened, chest rising and falling. You're good with words, huh? Must have read a lot of law books. He circled around behind black shoes, striking rhythmically against the cement. But out here, I don't need books. I've got power. Malcolm turned slowly, sunlight casting a soft glow across the ridge of his cheek, a muted brightness against dark skin. Power doesn't mean permission to abuse it, he said. It only exists when used right. Holden gave a dry laugh, hands on his hips, postured like someone who owned the stage. You sound like a professor. Let's see how far that gets you once you're cuffed. A sudden gust scattered old newspapers at their feet, pages fluttering between them like leaves in a storm. Malcolm didn't respond, his gaze shifting to the cafe sign reflecting their figures in the window, warped shapes. One standing upright, the other hunched, two tones clashing in sun and shadow. Holden stepped in closer, voice lower now, just loud enough for nearby ears. You think that suit makes you different from the rest of them out here? I see you all the same. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, eyes steady, voice softer still. That's sad. coming from someone wearing a uniform paid to protect them. The words landed light but sharp, and Holden faltered, his face tightening like he'd swallowed his own sentence. A car horn blared in the distance, echoing off the glass walls. Holden stepped back, trying to collect himself, but his voice had shifted, no longer smug, but edged with aggression. "You really think anyone cares about this? That attitude, that righteous tone just makes it easier to get blood on you?" Malcolm didn't raise his voice, but each word landed clearly. "Then, remember, those who draw blood never keep their hands clean." He finished and went quiet. The heat thickened the air to a near breaking point. A bead of sweat slid from Holden's temple down his neck as he blinked, glancing around to see a few people recording the irritation in him rising like a wind against his pride. He threw his arm up and shouted, "Everyone back up! This is police business!" The yell bounced off the glass and snapped back louder, pulling more eyes toward them. A woman gasped and someone raised their phone higher. Malcolm stayed still, a breeze shifting the hem of his suit coat. His voice dropped slower now, each word deliberate. "You're turning a traffic stop into your own bad morality play." Holden clenched his jaw, two fingers brushing the edge of his holster, his eyes flashing with fury. "How I teach is my business. You just answer when you're asked." Malcolm exhaled, a faint smile crossing his lips, not mocking, more like mourning something lost. "That's the shame of it. I used to think cops knew the difference between power and hate." Holden froze his hand, trembling slightly, but he kept his posture like a man unwilling to step down. "You're clever. I'll remember that when I write this up." Malcolm met his eyes. "Good, because next time you might be writing it from an interrogation room." Their eyes locked, neither blinking, neither backing off. A taxi honked behind them, its horn slicing through the moment. Holden gave a short laugh and turned away, but his shoulders stayed tense. Malcolm slowly lowered his hands, watching the officer walk off into the sunlight, leaving behind the thick smell of smoke and anger. In that instant, Malcolm knew this wasn't over, because a poisoned word had just been planted, and it would grow fed by power and hate until someone was forced to cut it down at the root. Malcolm looked around. A few people were still there, their eyes caught between curiosity and unease. Across the street, a boy clutched his mother's hand and whispered something he couldn't quite hear. He stepped back into the car, shut the door with a soft metallic click. His hand rested on the folder in the passenger seat, eyes half closed like he was calculating something. Outside, Holden had returned to the patrol car, speaking sharply to Dean Rowe, gesturing toward Malcolm as if to underline that this wasn't finished. The sun still burned bright, its glare bouncing off the hood, and in that harsh light, Malcolm saw his own reflection ripple among the crowd, small but defined like a reminder that every confrontation with injustice leaves a mark, whether in words or in the eyes that refuse to look down. The midday wind blew in from the boulevard, lifting fine dust into the air and blurring the space between the long row of cars lined up on Hawthorne Street. Heat radiated off the pavement, making the scene shimmer slightly, as if the air itself were evaporate. Malcolm stood by his car door, sunlight wrapped around his body, reflecting off the window and making his eyes behind the lenses dim, then flare again. Across from him, Ray Holden tilted his head, signaling to his partner Dean Rowe, who stood motionless by the patrol car, hesitation written all over his face. "Turn it on?" Holden, muttered voice, low and rough. Dean reached for the body cam on his chest. The green light blinked on, followed by a short beep. But just a second later, Holden leaned in, his calloused hand pressing the power button hard. The light snapped off, and his voice slid into the air, dry and cold. "It's broken. Just do it." Malcolm saw it clearly. Through the reflective glass, he watched Holden lean in, saw the camera light vanish, and caught that strange smile on the officer's face, the smile of someone erasing part of the record. "You just deleted your own evidence," Malcolm said slowly, his voice steady, the reflection of the red traffic light flaring behind him like a warning. Holden paused, his hand twitched slightly, his eyes sweeping over Malcolm like they meant to shred his calm. "Evidence," he growled, biting off each word, "is what I say, it is not what you do." The crowd nearby went silent. Car horns stopped leaving only the wind slipping through alleys and the rustle of a plastic bag catching air before falling back to the street. Dean looked uneasy, his eyes drifting elsewhere while Holden took a step closer, his body carrying the stale mix of sweat and cigarette smoke. "You're really sure of yourself," Malcolm said, his gaze unshaken. "But it's a shame the law doesn't agree." The words weren't loud, but clear enough that people in the front of the crowd could hear, and one woman's phone rose a bit higher in response. Holden noticed his eyes flicked quickly, his hand dropped to his belt where the holster swung gently. The tension pressed in like trapped heat waiting for a spark. "You recording this?" Holden asked, his voice low and urgent. The woman didn't answer, eyes locked on her screen. "I'm talking to you," Holden snapped, turning to Malcolm. "What are you trying to pull, planning to post this online? Be some kind of hero?" Malcolm leaned slightly, the light glinting across the collar of his shirt. "I just want you to do your job by the book, that's all," he replied. Holden let out a dry laugh, but it carried no humor, more like metal grinding on stone. "The law? You think something written in those books is going to protect you? Around here, I am the law." Malcolm stayed quiet for a few seconds, the wind rustling paper around his feet. Then he spoke softly. "You just proved why the law needs to exist." Holden curled his lip, sweat forming on his brow, his eyes like twin blades. "You love your big words, huh? Let me put it plain around here. People like you just need to lower your head. Simple, fast, and that's the end of it." The sentence drew a sharp breath from a few in the crowd, whispers spreading like fire, catching wind. Malcolm looked around and saw faces filled with doubt, some afraid, some angry, but most just watching, waiting to see what would happen. He knew one wrong move and the whole thing could collapse. Holden stepped closer, his finger brushing the grip of his gun, sunlight catching on the polished metal. Malcolm didn't back down, locking eyes with him, his voice low but firm. "You think that gun makes you strong? It doesn't. It just makes people afraid. And once the fear's gone, you've got nothing left." Holden clenched his jaw, heat rising to his face, but instead of drawing his weapon, he curled his fists tight, the joints cracking loudly. "You're playing with fire," he said, voice hoarse. "I already warned you," Malcolm answered, tone unchanged. "And you just lit the match." Dean Rowe stood frozen, his eyes darting between the two men, fists clenched at his side. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped lowering his head. That one gesture was enough for Malcolm to understand just how deep the silence ran in this system. Holden still blocked his path, breath hot and close voice dropping low. "You think I haven't seen people like you act clean and get dragged out in cuffs anyway? In the end, you're all the same." Malcolm spoke slowly, every word distinct. "You're not arresting me. You're sinking yourself." A flash of light flicked off a phone lens and Holden spun around, shouting, "Turn that off." The woman stepped back, startled, but held her phone steady. "I have the right to film. This is a public space," she said. Holden sucked in air and turned back to Malcolm, his face, flushed lips twitching like he was swallowing curses. "You see that?" he hissed. "People like you always find a way to make us look bad," Malcolm replied. "You did that yourself. I'm just standing here." Holden paused, then jabbed a finger toward his face. "You're challenging me." Malcolm glanced down at the finger pointed at him, then looked up, voice low and cold enough to cut through traffic. "No, I'm holding up a mirror." In that moment, Dean closed his eyes while Holden stepped back half a pace, his hand gripping the gun handle tight. The police radio inside the cruiser crackled to life, the voice of the dispatcher cutting through code 714 downtown sector report status. Holden didn't answer, his eyes still locked on Malcolm, chest rising and falling. The moment stretched a wire, pulled to its limit. Then, suddenly, Malcolm bowed his head slightly, sunlight bouncing off the pavement and onto his cheek, making his gaze sharp as a blade. "You're being recorded," he said, "even if your body cam's off." Holden narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Malcolm replied, calm and steady. "Yours isn't the only lens." Holden spun around and saw at least 3 phones raised in the crowd. His pupils widened, then narrowed again, and his hand trembled slightly. The sense of control he held just seconds ago drained from him like it had been pulled straight out of his body. Malcolm Malcolm said nothing more. The sunlight reflecting off the car window behind them stayed blood red, a living reminder that truth, even when switched off with a button, finds its own way back to light. In the thick heat, everything fell silent. The only sound was the wind sweeping across the street, carrying the scent of metal and the pounding hearts of those watching power strangle itself. The wind carried dust and heat from the pavement swirling through the small square where footsteps were gradually coming to a stop. The scene ahead pulled people in like a magnetic force. Sunlight bounced off the large storefront windows, making the space almost blindingly white. Ray Holden stood in the middle of the street, shoulders tense, sweat trailing down his neck, his shouting voice bouncing off the walls of sound around him. "Sit on the ground," I said. "Sit down." His voice tore through the silence, sharp and raw, making those closest step back. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes burned, not with duty, but with the fire of someone who had lost control. Malcolm Vance stood an arm's length away, his face calm, no trace of fear. He took a breath, letting the sunlight reach his eyes, and spoke softly but loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You're losing control, officer." The words landed like a precise blade. Holden froze, jaw tightening, a twitch in his cheek, then a low hiss escaped through clenched teeth. "I'm teaching you the law." His hands dropped, then rose again, his index finger jabbing straight into Malcolm's chest as if trying to pierce through that calm. "I'm listening," Malcolm replied, eyes steady. "Are you teaching with words or with a gun?" The crowd murmured, a few people crouched down and others lifted their phones higher. The moment was captured from every angle, the flashing lights from dozens of screens turning the square into a temporary stage. Holden realized he was being filmed, but instead of stopping, the awareness poured fuel on the fire already burning in his chest. He stepped closer, voice now heavy and rough like metal dragging across concrete. "You think silence is wisdom? You think that look in your eyes makes me back down?" Malcolm responded, his gaze unwavering, cold and direct. "I think reason is the only thing that should make someone back down." A sharp beam of light flared off the metal of the gun at Holden's waist. Behind him, Dean Rowe hovered, one hand halfway between intervening and staying back, his eyes darting between the two men like someone trapped between two lines. The crowd pressed in, the sound of slow footsteps and hushed voices blending into a hum of fear and curiosity. Holden clenched his teeth, a vein rising at his temple. Then he shouted, voice roaring above the traffic noise. "I said, sit down." Malcolm didn't move, didn't step back or forward. He stood still in the middle of the street, sunlight slicing across his face like a blade. "You're losing control, officer," he repeated this time, his voice lower, colder than the light pouring down. Holden stared at him, his lip twitching before twisting into a crooked smile. "I'm not losing control. I'm doing my job," Malcolm answered. "You're disgracing the uniform you wear." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Few people nodded, and some slowed their recording to capture every detail. Holden heard it, but instead of stepping back, he spun toward the onlookers and shouted, "You all want to be arrested for interference." No one answered, only more. Phones were raised. Malcolm stepped forward half a pace, eyes steady. "Have you forgotten who writes the law?" Holden froze, his pupils narrowing as Malcolm's voice carried on, steady and sharp, like metal striking metal in the air. "The law is written to protect people from blindness, not to be turned into a weapon by those afraid of losing power." A gust of wind blew through, lifting a citation slip from Holden's pocket, spinning it down the street before it caught beneath a tire. He followed it with his eyes, but his gaze quickly shifted back to Malcolm, now mixed with anger and confusion. Dean stepped forward slightly, his voice low but urgent. "Ray, stop it. People are filming." "Let them film," Holden snapped. "I'll show them what obedience looks like." He reached out and shoved Malcolm hard in the shoulder, but the force only made him shift slightly. He stayed upright. Malcolm didn't strike back. He looked straight at him, eyes darkening, voice low like metal dropping into water. "You're revealing who you really are, and everyone is watching." Holden yanked his hand back, his breath quickened, face flushed red. red. The square had fallen into complete silence, broken only by the hum of the patrol car's fan spinning steadily. A drop of sweat fell from Holden's chin and hit the pavement with an audible tap. "You think these people will take your side?" he shouted. "Tomorrow, they'll forget everything. I'll still be a cop, and you'll still be the one explaining himself." Malcolm looked at him calm. "You're wrong. They might forget my face tomorrow, but they'll remember yours today." The words hit like a strike into open air, making Holden flinch slightly, while Dean lowered his gaze, lips pressed tightly together. From a distance, the sound of an ambulance siren filtered in, blending with the vague hum of city life, as if signaling something on the verge of collapse. Holden looked around and saw nothing but silence except for the phones still recording their screens, casting faint reflections on the badge pinned to his chest. Suddenly, he shouted, almost screamed, his voice hoarse. "Turn them off. I'm on duty." But no one moved. They stood still, eyes locked between curiosity and rising anger. Malcolm exhaled slowly and said quietly, "Your duty is to protect, not to intimidate." Holden turned back his eyes, flashing with one last flicker of rage, his lips trembling. "I said shut up. You could silence this entire street," Malcolm replied, voice low enough to chill, "but you can't stop the truth." Silence fell like a thick fog. Holden lowered his hand, stood frozen for a few seconds, then turned to Dean, his voice barely holding together. "Get back to the car." Dean nodded and walked away without looking back, his figure melting into the flow of people. Holden stayed rooted, breathing heavy, his eyes lost in the crowd still holding up their phones. Malcolm turned slightly light, catching on his cheekbone, and as he began to walk, the crowd parted, forming a narrow path. No one spoke, but within that silence everyone understood cracks had just formed, and from this point on nothing would be the same again. The heat on Hawthorne Street was so intense that it made everything look like it was burning. Sweat rolled down Ray Holden's neck, soaking into his collar and dripping onto his chest, but he didn't seem to notice. Rage had pushed the blood to his head, his temples pulsing hard with each heartbeat. The sounds around him, people whined car horns, heavy breathing blurred into a chaotic noise until all he could hear was the pounding inside his own chest. Malcolm Vance stood motionless, his calm gaze almost unbearable, as if he didn't belong in the boiling air around them. His face lit up from sunlight bouncing off the pavement, while Holden, just a few steps away, suddenly screamed, voice cracking in the heat. "I'll count to 3. Get on your knees." The words tore through the air sharp and loud, making a few people in the crowd flinch and step back. Phones kept recording the quiet hum of devices mixing with heavy breaths. Malcolm looked at Holden, his face still composed, eyelids lowered slightly like someone watching a child throw their first tantrum. "You should put that gun away," he said, slow and clear. Holden clenched his teeth, his hand shaking finger on the trigger. Sweat made the grip slippery and the glare off the metal blurred his vision. Dean Rowe stood a few meters back, face pale, lips moving, but no words coming. 1. Holden roared. 2. His whole body trembled, breath breaking apart. Malcolm didn't step back, didn't raise his hands. He simply pulled the collar of his suit gently aside. A flash of gold cut through the air so bright it made Holden squint. A round metal badge glinted in the sun, the words engraved in full Internal Affairs Division. "Chief." Malcolm's voice rang out not loud but echoing through the breathless square. "You just pointed a gun at the Chief of Internal Affairs." Each word dropped like a hammer, and the crowd erupted in a stunned gasp. Dean turned his head, whispering shakily, "Jesus Christ." Holden froze his eyes, drifting from Malcolm to the badge. His grip loosened, and the gun slid from his hand, hitting the pavement with a sharp metallic clatter that rang out like an alarm bell. The air felt frozen. Everyone saw the same thing. The man Holden had tried to arrest wasn't a lawbreaker, but the one with the power to review every officer like him. Malcolm's gaze didn't shift his calm, only making Holden more unsteady. His breathing grew rapid, tiny veins twitching under the skin of his neck. He stepped back half a pace, but his legs barely responded. Dean moved forward, his voice shaken. "Ray, walk away. We're done." But Holden didn't hear. His eyes were full of fear and shame. His mouth opened as if to speak, but his lips only trembled. Malcolm lowered his collar, the glare from the badge fading. He stepped forward, each move steady, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. "I used to think I'd seen every kind of officer who abused power," he said, "but you made me realize arrogance and fear can live together in the same uniform." Holden inhaled sharply, his fists clenched, his voice cracked. "You set me up," Malcolm replied, gaze still cold. "No, you did that to yourself." Dean bowed his head, shoulders trembling, then stepped back as if watching something beyond what he could bear. It all happened in seconds, but felt like a full play compressed into the street. Holden stepped forward, halfway about to say more, when Malcolm lifted his hand slightly. The motion was calm, without force, yet enough to freeze the air. Holden's eyes flickered, his hand rose as if to block something, but Malcolm had already moved. A quick, precise motion. The sound cracked, one clean punch, no wasted energy, not wild, but it landed square on the jaw. Holden's whole body collapsed like a tree cut at the root. His head hitting the pavement, his gun spinning once more before stopping at Malcolm's feet. The sharp clink of metal echoed out, followed by a silence so complete it felt like time had stopped. Dean shot a glance at Malcolm, his eyes filled with a mix of shock and fear. The crowd pressed in, dozens of phones raised in unison, the blue light of their screens casting a glow across the scene, turning it into a cinematic moment where no one dared to breathe. Malcolm bent down, picked up the gun, flipped it in his hand, and set it gently beside Holden, then looked up. Sunlight swept across his face, striking his eyes and making them shine like steel. He spoke slowly, each word clear, directed at Dean and at everyone filming. "This is the consequence for someone who forgot that power is granted not to be flaunted, but to be held accountable." Dean swallowed hard, his lips trembling slightly. Are you going to file a report?" Malcolm gave a small nod. "I don't need to. Everything's already been recorded." He looked around. The crowd still stood there, their eyes caught between fear and a quiet awe. Holden lay on the pavement, his hand twitching slightly, his breath broke, his face slick with sweat and dust. Malcolm stepped away, his voice low, but steady enough to carry to the ears, waiting for it. "Someone call for medical. Even when he's wrong, he's still someone the law protects." The crowd parted, opening a narrow path for Malcolm to walk through. Phones still pointed at him, lights blinking nonstop. Dean crouched beside Holden, mumbling a prayer, while more sirens in the distance grew louder by the second. On the pavement, the stain of sweat and dust where Holden had fallen was clearly marked, while the gold badge on Malcolm's chest kept shining in the sun, like a quiet reminder that justice doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be seen. As Malcolm crossed the street, wind from the direction of City Hall swept through, carrying loose papers around his feet. He didn't look back. Behind him, the sunlight reflected on the road, forming a small halo around where Holden lay. And in that perfect silence, people began to understand. Seconds later wasn't just the fall of one officer. It was the moment an entire system had to face its own reflection. Jenna Ruiz had only planned to stop by Hawthorne Street for coffee before class, but the shouting and the crowd gathering pulled her to a halt. Instincts, sharpened by life in the digital age, made her reach for her phone faster than thought. When the lens came on, the first image to hit her screen was a police officer collapsed in the sun, his gun flung aside, and a black man in a purple suit standing tall in the center of the crowd, sunlight catching a gold badge on his chest. The footage shook in her hands, but was clear enough for anyone to see the raw reversal between the one given orders and the one expected to follow. Jenna's hands trembled, and her voice slipped through the mic. "Oh my God, that cop just got taken down by his own boss." The live stream's auto caption flashed, "Cop gets knocked by his own boss." In less than 10 minutes, Jenna's live stream was being shared everywhere. From downtown coffee shops to high-rise offices, people started replaying the moment, rewinding, zooming in, freezing the frame where Malcolm pulled his collar aside to reveal the gold badge, then the sharp metallic thud of the gun hitting the pavement. Comments flooded in hundreds, then thousands. Instant karma. This is real justice. Who is he? Looks like FBI. The crowd in the digital world blended with the breathless crowd in the real one, all witnessing a symbol flipped on its head. Jenna's lens, once shaken in her hand, was now reposted by major outlets under headlines like "When Justice Fights Back." Malcolm Vance didn't yet know the name of the girl who had just shown the entire country what happened. He walked slowly away from the scene through the sweltering light. The shuffle of pedestrian shoes, Dean Rowe's ragged breathing, the clink of metal behind him. All of it came together in a strange kind of sound, tired but clean. The sunlight bounced off his purple suit, making the fabric glow like it had been dusted in steel. Every step he took pulled the eyes of people lining the sidewalks. His face remained calm, but inside, Malcolm knew he had just ended a chain of wrongs he'd watched for too long. He didn't look back. He didn't need to check on Holden. He knew justice had spoken in its own way through truth recorded, not words defended. Behind him, the scene turned chaotic. Ray Holden lay collapsed in the street, blood from the corner of his mouth mixing with dust, sweat, and harsh sunlight, all blending into a pale, washed-out tone. Dean Rowe knelt beside him, hands trembling as he gripped his phone, trying to dial emergency services, but failing. His sweat-slick fingers kept sliding across the screen. His voice caught in his throat, tangled in fear and regret. "Ray, come on, stay with me, Ray," Dean called, but Holden didn't answer, only gasped for air, his eyes wide-locked on the blinding white sky. The crowd stayed frozen, some fearful, some angry, but no one stepped away. Jenna backed up a few steps, the live stream still running, her hands shaking so badly the footage blurred, but her voice stayed steady, almost a whisper. That man, he just walked away without saying a word. And the officer, "Has anyone called for help?" A middle-aged man answered. "The other cop is trying, but his hands are shaking too much." That line went out through the live stream, sending thousands of viewers into silence. Reaction emojis scrolled up the screen. Hearts, angry faces, tears. In the center of the chat, one comment appeared and was pinned to the top. "This is the first time I've seen justice take form." Malcolm kept walking, each step pulling the sounds behind him further away. He knew he had just stepped into the center of a public firestorm, but it didn't change his pace. At the intersection, he stopped and looked up at a street sign glowing in the light like a blurred mirror. His reflection blended with the waiting traffic, his eyes lowered, then shut briefly as if weighing the silence against the waves still coming. A young man recognized him and shouted, "Hey, that's him, the guy from the video." His group rushed forward, phones raised. Malcolm turned his gaze calm and said softly, "Don't turn truth into spectacle." He walked away, leaving behind the cheers and calls as the distant siren of an ambulance stretched into the heat like a tight string pulled through sunlight. Dean stayed beside Holden, his voice cracking. "Hang on, they're coming." He gripped his partner's shoulder, his eyes wide with confusion like a child lost in the dark. Holden turned his head slightly, his lips quivering, his voice thinner than a breath. What did I just do?" Dean didn't answer. In that moment, silence weighed more than any explanation. The phone camera kept recording, capturing the image of a police officer collapsed in the street, his uniform dusty, his gun lying useless beside his hand. When the ambulance arrived, 2 paramedics stepped out and pushed through the crowd. One asked who called. Dean raised his hand, his voice caught in his throat. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Jenna's video had passed 500,000 views. Local news stations shared it simultaneously, anchors speaking in even tones. A shocking incident has just occurred on Hawthorne Street. A police officer was taken down by his direct superior, confirmed to be Internal Affairs Chief Malcolm Vance. Millions stopped to watch the clip. Some felt satisfied satisfaction. Others stayed silent, but all were drawn to the same question. What is justice when even the one sworn to enforce it must act to defend its name? Malcolm walked down the narrow street leading to the parking lot, sunlight tracing a thin gold outline along his back. In the distance, ambulance sirens blended with police sirens, then faded into the wind. Jenna ended the live stream, her fingers trembling as the words 500K views appeared. Her heart pounded so fast she barely realized she had just opened the door to a media storm. She turned off her phone and looked back toward the square where Holden was still being lifted onto a stretcher, the white light from the sky washing his face pale like ash. In another corner, Dean bowed his head, his eyes lost a single sentence echoing in his mind. You just pointed a gun at the Chief of Internal Affairs. And, just like that, from the shaky lens of a student who happened to pass by a story named Justice, began to spread faster than any police siren the city had ever heard. In just one night, Hawthorne Street went from a forgotten corner to the center of national attention. From phone screens and laptops to morning news broadcasts, the names Ray Holden and Malcolm Vance appeared everywhere, two poles in an argument with no end. The video, filmed by Jenna Ruiz, was shared millions of times, becoming the focus of every news outlet and talk show. Just 2 minutes long, the clip hit harder than any weapon. It began with Holden's shout paused on the moment the gun hit the ground, and ended with Malcolm Vance walking away under the sun, the glare of his badge cutting like a blade. Within hours, social media reposted the footage under a single caption, "Cop taken down by his own boss." The next morning, national news led with a split screen. On one side was Jenna's shaky, overexposed footage. On the other hand, crisp traffic camera video from a nearby intersection. The headline read, "Racist Cop versus Internal Affairs Chief." Beneath it, Holden's gun-pointed moment was played again and again, each replay slicing deeper into the public image of law enforcement. The anchor's voice stayed steady, but viewers' eyes locked on the frame, where Malcolm pulled back his collar, revealing the gold badge. That moment, though only seconds long, was enough to reshape the idea of justice for millions. Online, a storm of comments exploded. One person wrote, "Finally someone taught them a lesson." Another argued, "Even a superior can't assault a cop." Among thousands of voices, the conversation stopped being about two men. It became about a country forced to examine itself. Talk shows brought in legal experts, psychologists, and even former police officers to debate. They froze the moment Holden pulled his weapon and asked, "Was this instinct or something deeper ingrained?" One female host looked into the studio lights and posed the question. If Malcolm Vance hadn't been Chief of Internal Affairs, but just a regular citizen, would it have ended in a punch or a body? Meanwhile, in a corner of the screen, Holden's close-up appeared. His uniform, wrinkled eyes, tired voice subdued, trying to maintain composure in front of the camera. "I didn't know who he was." Holden said, his hands clasped on the table. "I was just doing my job." His defense was played again and again, but every time it was paired with the sound of the gun hitting the pavement, a rebuttal louder than word. On the other side, a reporter read Malcolm Vance's background, former federal agent, now Chief of Internal Affairs with authority to investigate all police misconduct in the state. That detail only fueled the public's anger. Holden hadn't just disrespected a man, he had pointed a gun at the very agency meant to keep him in check. Dean Rowe, the silent partner throughout the incident, quickly became a target of media attention. Reporters packed the sidewalk outside his apartment, microphones raised camera flashes nonstop. Dean opened the door in plain clothes, eyes, uncertain voice catching as he spoke. "I have nothing to say." Everything was said in that video. The line was short, but honest enough to stay with people. On screen, subtitles repeated his words before cutting to footage of Holden walking out of the police station, head down, his wrists loosely bound in safety cuffs. At the same time, Thousands of posts flooded social platforms. One anonymous user reposted the video with the caption, "Doesn't matter who he is, what matters is how you treat someone you think is beneath you." The comment was pinned and spread like an arrow through the crowd, making people pause a moment before scrolling. A simple sentence, but it carried the full weight of the truth. The issue wasn't identity, but how power is used when someone believes they're standing above others. Evening news coverage continued. Between commercials, footage of Malcolm walking through sunlight played in slow cuts like scenes from a political documentary. A veteran journalist remarked, "This isn't just about one officer losing control. It's about the fractures in public trust." From corner bars to city government offices, people discussed the case, each with a different angle, but all agreeing on one point: Holden's every move had come from a dangerous kind of entitlement, the right to disrespect without consequence. That right was now gone, and his silence was being dissected nationwide. Malcolm Vance still hadn't spoken. He declined all interviews, refused to appear on camera, and issued only a short statement through his office. "I believe justice should be carried out through actions, not words." The message was brief, but it spread faster than any press conference. Many began calling him the man in the purple suit, an unexpected symbol of justice in an age drowning in noise. Across social media, people made memes, wrote captions, created hashtags, and even built 3D recreations of the scene. The story no longer belonged to Hawthorne Street. It had reached every state, every city, every community that had ever bowed beneath power. In the middle of all that noise, in a dark room on the outskirts of town, Holden sat in front of a laptop, his face hollow as he watched footage of himself replay on screen. Commentary layered over itself, voices arguing, laughter, anger, applause. He muted the sound, but the screen's glow still lit his face, revealing every trace of fear, regret, and self-pity. He whispered something even he couldn't hear clearly. "They'll never understand." Somewhere out there, millions were talking about justice. But in that room, one man was beginning to realize that sometimes judgment moves faster than a bullet, and once social media becomes the court, it never delivers a not guilty verdict. The media room at police headquarters that morning was thick with tension, the air so heavy it made every breath audible. Dozens of screens replayed the same video, but the footage had been spliced, the audio distorted, the dialogue subtly altered. Malcolm Vance, once seen calmly walking away from the crowd in his purple suit, was now edited into an aggressor stepping toward Holden, his mouth synced to a sentence he never spoke. "I'll make you kneel." The clip spread like wildfire, shared by hundreds of accounts with captions reading, "Black official assaults white officer in broad daylight." It was a perfect reversal engineered in hours with video tricks and long-standing hate. In the freezing air of the overworked AC unit, the head of media stared at the screen, voice hoarse. "If this catches on, we're looking at another street war." Online, fresh posts surfaced by the minute. A hero who stood up to black privilege. One headline, read in bold on an extremist forum, racking up thousands of likes. Holden, though suspended, was suddenly hailed as a symbol, a cop who stood for order. Old photos of him were edited and paired with slogans like "Justice for Officers." Meanwhile, Malcolm became the new target of rage, labeled arrogant or a power-drunk official. News broadcasts split between polarized narratives, one condemning police violence, the other outraged that justice had been hijacked. It all became a maze of warped truths where everyone only saw what they wanted to believe. Dean Rowe sat in front of the TV, hands gripping his head, vision blurring with every frame. He noticed Holden's voice pitch altered in the fake clip, Malcolm's words delayed just enough to make him seem threatening. "What are they doing?" Dean muttered, then grabbed his phone and called internal. The voice on the other end was flat. "We've got it under control." No need for you to interfere. Dean hung up the weight of helplessness, closing in Malcolm's words from that day echoing in his mind. You're sinking yourself. Now, it felt like the entire system was dragging the truth down with it. Elsewhere, in a small office building 3 blocks from downtown, Malcolm Vance sat in a windowless room. In front of him, a computer displayed copies of internal reports and links to the doctored video. Cold light reflected off his face, his eyes deep and still. A young media staffer entered, placing a printout on the desk, a recovered file from the body cam's temporary memory footage never before released. "You should see this," she said quietly. Malcolm played the video. It began grainy, then sharpened with street noise and radio chatter filtering in, followed by Holden's voice. "Cam's busted. Just do it." Malcolm paused, scrubbing back to the 18th second where the camera's light blinked off and Holden's hand pressed down on the power button. The room fell silent. Malcolm leaned back, took a deep breath, eyes closed for a few seconds. When he opened them, the look had changed. Not anger, but clarity. That afternoon, news leaked about the recovered body cam footage. Television networks received a short 30-second clip, but it was enough to rip through the false narrative surrounding the case. The 18th second, Holden shutting off the camera himself became the focus replayed non-stop, a final nail in every excuse made so far. The media storm flipped instantly. Those who had praised Holden went quiet. Some extremist accounts deleted posts. Headlines across outlets read, "Body cam shows officer intentionally disabled recording before drawn weapon." A new wave of comments surged in. "So who's the real aggressor?" Truth bites back. Thank God someone recovered the file. That evening, Malcolm Vance appeared on television for the first time since the incident. He wasn't wearing the purple suit, just a plain white shirt seated under soft studio lights. The host asked, "Do you want to respond to the altered clip that spread online?" Malcolm looked straight into the camera, his voice low and steady. "The truth doesn't need defending. It only needs to be allowed to exist." His gaze carried no anger, only resolve, and that calm presence haunted the entire studio. The host tried to think of a follow-up question, then simply smiled, letting the program ease into a long, uninterrupted silence. Right after the broadcast news outlets simultaneously reposted his words, the sentence bolded over a stark black and white background. "The truth doesn't need defending." That short phrase became a symbol shared millions of times, printed on images and used as overlays across the original footage. Jenna Ruiz, the one who recorded the first clip, also reposted the interview, adding the caption, "The man I filmed that day never shouted, never threatened. He just did what was necessary." The comments filled with rainbow icons and the line, "Justice doesn't scream, it acts." The next morning, inside the police department building, faces that once defended Holden fell unusually silent. Screens in the media room dimmed, leaving only a frozen frame, showing the moment Holden touched the body cam. People looked at each other, but no one spoke. In the corner, Dean Rowe stood leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on that frame, exhaling slowly. He knew what was cracking wasn't just an officer's honor, but the very foundation of a system. And somewhere out there, someone had just proved that in an era of deception, sometimes all it takes is 1 second of truth to silence the world. The cold light from the ceiling cast down onto the desk, reflecting off the covers of the stacked files reaching the edge of the chair. The internal office of the Inspector General's division was unusually quiet, filled only with the steady hum of a fan and the musty smell of old paper blending with stale coffee. Malcolm Vance sat alone in the room, facing a long list of unresolved cases, dusty reports marked with faded numbers. On the first page, the name Ray Holden stood out printed in bold under the heading Officer Misconduct File. Malcolm's eyes moved slowly, each line of data slicing like a small cut. each case a fragmented truth buried over time. The further he read, the more alarming the patterns became: withdrawn complaints, unreachable witnesses, edited reports submitted days late. The entire system seemed to be shielding a fracture that everyone knew existed, but no one wanted to touch. He stopped at a previous victim's name, Martin Hale, a brown-skinned man who had worked as a security guard at a Western commercial complex. Malcolm read the incident description and his heartbeat slowed. Martin was pulled over beaten with a baton after refusing to sign a falsified report. The file noted victim, permanently disabled, case closed due to lack of evidence. In the margin, the small line Officer R. Holden, suspended for review, appeared only to be crossed out in red ink. Malcolm froze. He remembered Martin had been on the internal investigation list he himself had overseen the previous year, but the case was dropped for lack of legal basis. Back then, he believed the submitted data was genuine. Now, looking again, every punctuation mark reeked of deceit. He continued through other files. Holden's name surfaced 4 more times, each involving the same pattern: abuse threats, forced signatures. The supervisor's notes all ended the same way: case closed, insufficient evidence. That phrase echoed in Malcolm's mind again and again, each time heavier than the last. He picked up a pen, struck through the line insufficient evidence with one bold stroke, and wrote beside it, evidence was ignored. The black ink cut across the paper, leaving behind firm, definitive marks like truth rising from under a thick layer of dust. On the other side of the glass wall, the city remained loud, but inside the room, time seemed to slow down, reduced to the sound of flipping pages and the steady breath of a man confronting the darkness he had lived with for far too long. Malcolm paused, his eyes stopping at the end of the file, the list of approvers. One signature made him freeze. The scrawled but unmistakable line read, R. Holden, acting under direct supervision of Lieutenant Green. He remembered that name clearly. Green had once been a senior officer in the Internal Affairs Unit, the one who had stood between him and command when Malcolm pushed to pursue a brutality case 5 years ago. At the time, Green had said quietly, "You're too rigid, Vance. Some things are better left alone." That line now echoed back like a cold shiver. Malcolm gently closed the file, his eyes locked on the words direct supervision, as if staring into a path leading straight down into a deeper void. What happened on Hawthorne Street was just a fragment of a larger picture, one where abuse of power thrived on silence and administrative nod. The overhead light flickered. Malcolm pulled out his phone, taking photos of each document page, every detail from the Martin Hale case, and sent them into a secure archive. His hand rested on the file cover, his eyes shifting from cold to resolute. He understood now this was no longer the investigation of one man, but a confrontation between justice and the culture of cover-up. As he stood, light from the window fell across his face, casting his shadow long across the wall, dividing light from dark. In that silent room, the soft click of the door lock echoed like the signal of a new chapter, opening one where justice no longer lived on paper, but began with someone willing to reread every line of the past. The door creaked open, light from the hallway spilling across the floor, blending into the chill of a room heavy with the scent of old paper. Malcolm remained by the desk, turning the final page of the file, his eyes landing on a faint line of notes. The sound of light footsteps behind him made him look up. Dean Rowe stepped in, his face pale from lack of sleep uniform, wrinkled eyes carrying the hesitation of a man caught between duty and fear. He stood just inside the doorway, as if afraid his voice might carry, then spoke in a tone so low it barely rose above a whisper, "I've been silent too long." The sentence wasn't just an admission, but a crack forming in the wall Dean had built around himself. Malcolm set the file down and looked at him, his gaze neither harsh nor soft. Between them, silence stretched, broken only by the steady tick of the wall clock, as if reminding them of the days when truth had been buried under silence. Dean stepped closer, his voice tight. "I was there the day he was accused by Martin Hale. I was ordered to rewrite the report to say the victim attacked first." He paused, his hand tightening into a fist. "I followed orders because I was scared. Back then, I was new to the force. They told me silence was loyalty." Malcolm listened, his eyes darkening, his voice calm. In the cold room, silence protects no one, especially not your conscience. Dean lowered his head, sighing, a bitter smile flickering across his lips. "I thought I could forget, but when I saw the video on Hawthorne Street, everything came back. I saw myself in him, in the way I stood by and watched." Malcolm folded his arms, and the white light reflecting off the badge on the desk lit his face with a strange glow. "So what do you want to do now?" he asked, his voice low. Dean looked at him, eyes glassy. "I want to tell the truth at least once in my life." Malcolm stepped closer, placing a hand on the younger officer's shoulder. "Then tell it with evidence, not emotion." He turned back to the desk, picked up a thin file, and slid it toward Dean. "This is a list of cases Holden was involved in, including altered statements. I need you to verify the signatures." Dean stared at the file, nodding slightly. "I'll do it." In that moment, the air in the room seemed to shift lighter but deeper, as if an unspoken agreement had just been made between two men. Light from the window cut across the desk, highlighting dust particles suspended in the air. Dean watched them, murmuring, as if to himself, "I used to think justice belonged to the strong, but maybe it starts with those who admit they were wrong." Malcolm turned his back, looking out through the glass, where the city wore the gray shade of late afternoon. He answered softly, "No justice can exist if the truth is buried alive." Dean remained silent, then nodded, his hand still resting on the file as if afraid it might vanish. The two men stood there under the white light with the ticking clock between them, like two fragments of a system trying to reclaim a voice that had been stolen. When Dean left, Malcolm stayed seated, his eyes following the door that had just closed, his lips moving in a whisper, barely audible. Every change begins with a confession. He opened his notebook and wrote one more line at the bottom, the ink soaking quickly into the page. "Begin again with the truth, no matter how late." And there, in that cold room, the fight for justice had just officially begun, with two voices brave enough to break the silence. That morning, the police headquarters was packed. On the steps leading into the building, dozens of reporters crowded in, microphones, raised camera lights flashing like lightning. The air was thick with the damp smell of newsprint, stale coffee, and body heat. The main doors opened, and the police chief stepped out into the press barricade, his face calm, but his voice clearly guarded. "We are cooperating fully with the investigation," he stated, each word echoed through the line of microphones. Behind him, senior officers stood in formation, their eyes aimed at the cameras, but their expressions scattered, mixed with unease. Reporters shouted overlapping questions. "Were you aware the body cam was turned off before the weapon was drawn? Who's accountable for Holden's misconduct? Will Malcolm Vance be investigated in return?" The entire scene became a storm of tangled sound. Outside, the signs started showing up. One group held a banner reading "Justice for All," standing near the barricade, facing another group with signs that said "Back the Blue." Two crowds, two shirt colors, two currents of anger and defense, standing like opposing sides of the same coin. On social media, the press conference was live-streamed, comments flowing every second, with hundreds of reaction emojis scrolling across the screen. One side demanded the dismissal of Holden's entire patrol unit, the other defended him as a misunderstood hero. The storm of justice had broken out not in court, but in the hearts of the people. Everyone believed they were standing on the side of what's right, and everyone saw the other as blind. Inside the briefing room, Malcolm Vance sat in silence, sunlight from the window reflecting off the case files he had brought. He listened to the rumors blaring through the external loudspeakers, feeling the cracks spreading across the city. Dean Rowe stood beside him, his face gaunt, gripping his written statement in one hand. "They're going to drag you into this debate," Dean murmured. Malcolm gave a small nod, his voice calm, but his eyes cold as steel. "Justice doesn't need defending, but it must be clarified." He stood and walked toward the door where daylight spilled in like a thin line between belief and chaos. Outside, the crowd kept chanting his name, some in praise, some in protest, all blending into a roar of a society re-examining itself. And in the middle of that storm, Malcolm understood that every fight for truth begins with a moment when someone chooses to stand still amid the noise. Malcolm Vance stepped into the auditorium amid the buzz of hundreds of reporters, whispering camera lenses sweeping like a swarm of bright eyes. The flashing lights lit up his face, casting his purple suit into a strange glow amid the sea of blue uniforms lined up behind him. The murmurs faded, the air thickened with anticipation. The police chief had just finished the official statement and was about to step down when the rear doors opened and Malcolm walked straight to the podium, no introduction needed. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, the sound of his shoes echoing like drum beats in the room tightened by tension. Reporters stood all at once, camera shutters clicked on mics, shot up, and lights focused on the man now standing still at the podium. Malcolm didn't bow. He placed both hands on the desk, his eyes scanning the serious faces before him. One officer seemed ready to protest, but Malcolm's gaze silenced the room. "I didn't come here to defend myself," he said, voice low and firm, "and I'm not here to excuse anyone. I came to speak about what this entire city is avoiding, the fear we carry inside ourselves." His opening line drew collective stillness. Some brought their recorders closer, others scribbled notes, while officers behind exchanged uneasy glances. Malcolm continued, the white light casting hard lines across his cheekbones, making his face look carved from stone. "I hear people say justice is divided, that in this country, each skin color carries a different kind of fear. But there's something even more dangerous when we use power to legitimize that fear." He paused, scanned the room again, then spoke slowly, his voice sweeping across the rows. "No skin color should ever be more feared than the truth." The words landed hard, cutting through the compressed silence, freezing the entire auditorium. Those recording froze for a beat, then flashes erupted. Each of his words felt carved into the walls, echoing through microphones, spilling out the doors, blending with the chants of the crowd at the gates. The police chief sat behind him, leaning slightly, his lips tightly pressed. A reporter called out, "Do you believe you've overstepped your authority by speaking here?" Malcolm answered calmly, "Justice has no limit on who may speak it." As he spoke, his eyes locked with the police row where Dean Rowe stood silently, his face visibly shaken. Malcolm stepped away from the podium, the cameras trailing every move. As he passed the press line, a young reporter lifted a mic, voice trembling. "Do you believe justice will win?" Malcolm stopped, didn't turn, but his voice rang out clear. "Justice doesn't need to win, it only needs to exist." He kept walking out of the hall, leaving behind whispers, stunned stares, and a sentence that had just become the axis of the debate shaking the city. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled across the doorway, lighting up the floor, and within that brightness, Malcolm's silhouette merged into the crowd waiting for him, a living symbol of a truth that had just been named. The federal courtroom that morning was eerily quiet. White lights beamed directly onto the defendant's bench, casting a stark glow over Ray Holden's pale skin. He sat with his head bowed, fingers tightly interlocked, his collar wrinkled, each heavy breath echoing in a space where every sound seemed amplified. Above him, the national emblem hung on the marble wall, cold and imposing. The gallery was full-packed with reporters, some witnesses from the Hawthorne incident, and others simply there to see in person the man who once represented authority and now embodied misconduct. Malcolm Vance sat in the third row on the left, upright, his expression calm but eyes locked on Holden. He had been through dozens of hearings, but something about this one felt different, heavier, more real, as if justice were being forced to look at itself. When the judge signaled, the prosecutor played the video on the large screen. The first sounds were wind and distant sirens. Then Holden's voice, "Turn it on." The image shook slightly, the green light of the body cam flickered, then went dark. The entire room held its breath. Time seemed to freeze at the moment Holden's hand covered the lens. The short beep of shutdown landing like a blow. In the press row, someone quietly took notes, while a woman clutched her notebook so tightly a bead of sweat dropped onto the page. Holden looked up, dark circles under his eyes, exhaustion plain. The judge's voice rang out slow and firm. "Do you have any reason for disabling your device while on duty?" The question fell like a gavel. Holden opened his mouth, tongue seemingly dry, his eyes flickering, then his voice cracked. I was afraid of losing control." The room stirred. Some scoffed, others fell silent. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, his voice steady. "Were you afraid of losing control while exercising power, or while facing someone you believed to be beneath you?" Holden looked down, didn't answer, his hands tightening until his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor continued, "So you admit to intentionally disabling evidence?" Holden swallowed hard, voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to. I just thought I needed to stay safe." "For whom?" The question came from Malcolm's row, quiet, but loud enough to turn heads. Holden looked up, locking eyes with him. They stared at each other, a long and weighty look, two ends of the same mistake. Holden looked away, silent. Outside the courtroom window, the midday light streamed in, sweeping across the lawyer's table, revealing tiny specks of dust floating in the air. The judge sighed, flipped through the file again, his voice soft but firm. "Police officers are granted power not to use it as a wall for their fear, but to uphold the order of human dignity. When you turned off the camera, you didn't just shut off a device, you shut off the public's trust." The words made Holden tremble slightly. He bit his lip until it bled. In the back row, Dean Rowe lowered his head, his hand clenched. Malcolm leaned forward, looked at Holden one last time, then turned to the judge, his eyes reflecting a calm resolve tinged with regret. The trial continued with questions and statements, but no one seemed to care about the legal details anymore, because in just one moment the truth had spoken for itself. When the video ended, the room seemed to dim slightly, leaving a pale white glow from the lights on Holden's face. He sat, still silent, under dozens of eyes boring into him. And in the back row, Malcolm leaned back gently, took a deep breath, and one thought echoed within him, that justice doesn't need a weapon to end a man, it only needs to show him his own reflection in the mirror of truth. Malcolm Vance sat in the very last row, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the screen ahead where the body cam footage played in slow motion. The room was silent, the green light from the screen casting a glow on his face, making his calm features appear cold and deep. Every second that passed on the screen felt like a blade slicing through the memory of that scorching noon on Hawthorne Street, where justice was twisted into a tool and where he had to act to restore order. Everyone watched Malcolm's reaction, but he remained still, his gaze steady, his breathing slow and even. His eyes seemed to pierce through the footage past Holden's bowed figure ahead. Stopping at the moment a hand touched the camera, the instant truth was smothered by a seemingly harmless gesture. Up front, the judge requested the video to be replayed once more. The entire courtroom focused on the small screen where the light abruptly flicked off and was replaced by black. No one spoke, but all understood that the second marked the line between right and wrong. Malcolm leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes still locked on the screen as if trying to see through every small detail hidden in the dark. He knew someone would have to speak because truth doesn't find its way out if everyone chooses silence. And that moment came sooner than expected. Dean Rowe, who had stood behind Holden that day, suddenly stood up. The sound of the chair scraping the floor cut sharply through the room, drawing every eye to him. Dean gripped the edge of the table, his voice low but clear. "I confirm," he ordered the camera off. That sound struck like thunder in a room already heavy with tension. Holden jerked his head up, eyes wide with a mix of shock and anger. "Dean, what are you doing?" he shouted, springing to his feet, but the two escorting officers immediately pressed down on his shoulders. Dean didn't flinch, his voice steady. "I've stayed silent long enough, and that made me an accomplice." A few in the courtroom gasped, reporters scribbled down every word, and cameras flashed in bursts. Malcolm remained still, his gaze shifted slightly and landed on Dean. In that moment, their eyes met a silent thank you, a mutual recognition between two men who chose to face the truth even if late. The judge called for order, but inside everyone present, the trial had already reached its answer. Holden slumped back into his seat, hands covering his face, his breath heavy. The court clerk's pen moved swiftly and decisively, recording Dean's statement like a blade cutting into the verdict awaiting ahead. Malcolm closed his eyes, bowed his head slightly, and his lips moved so faintly no one heard, but Dean understood he had just said, "Thank you." Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of Fee. It was the silence of something finally released. The white ceiling lights cast a glow across the wall behind Malcolm, projecting his shadow long and clear on the floor. It was the silhouette of someone who had just witnessed justice being named not through outrage, but through the courage of two people willing to admit what was right in a place where lies had once been honored. The night inside the holding wing of the federal facility was thick and damp. The yellow light from the ceiling bulb cast a small circle over the stained concrete floor surrounding Ray Holden, the man who once stood tall in the street, now curled into a cold metal chair. Outside, the sound of patrolling boots faded, leaving a strange stillness broken only by the steady drip of water from a pipe above. Holden looked up at the ceiling, his eyes dark from sleeplessness, his face marked with deep fatigue. In his mind, the afternoon at Hawthorne Street played on repeat like a jammed reel in a projector. Malcolm Vance's voice echoed somewhere in that memory, every word sharp. "Did you forget who writes the law?" That line repeated over and over like wind scraping against the walls. Holden took a deep breath, closed his eyes, then let out a dry horse laugh. "Yeah," he muttered, "I forgot the law can hit back." His laugh cracked and echoed through the narrow space, bouncing off the walls before fading, leaving only the weight of his breath. He tilted his head and stared at his own hand, the same hand that once gripped a gun, gave orders, and made others bow. Now it trembled slightly, the joints, swollen fingernails, dusty. He rubbed a bruise on his wrist slowly and laughed again, quieter this time, almost like a confession. "I thought the law was a wall," he said to no one. "Turns out it's a mirror." A vision of Malcolm in the purple suit came to him, calm eyes, voice firm as stone. Everything Holden once called weakness, silence, composure, restraint had become the very thing that undid him. The cell door creaked open, light from the hallway spilling in as a guard placed a food tray on the table. Without a word, then shut the door. The clink of metal startled Holden. He looked at the tray but didn't touch it, instead lowering his head, elbows on knees, gaze empty. On the wall, the flickering bulb reflected part of his face on the polished steel surface. In that reflection, he looked unfamiliar, like he was seeing someone else. He muttered, "I used to think I held power. Now power holds me." The words broke into the space, floating in the air with the wind slipping through the bars. Outside, a group of reporters still waited for updates, but inside the cell, Holden no longer cared about public opinion. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the small window where streetlight spilled into a thin streak on the floor. Something inside him was shifting, not full remorse, but a delayed awareness of the value of what he once dismissed. He closed his eyes, breathed slowly, then let out a sentence barely audible. "Now I get it. Justice doesn't strike back, it waits for you to see it." The words dissolved into the dark, drifted through the bars, and mingled with the rain falling in the prison yard. Somewhere in that deep stillness, Tiny cracks were forming inside Holden, revealing something that had never existed before, a sense of conscience, waking up after a life buried beneath power. The next morning, as sunlight hit the gray brick walls of the federal building, social media was filled with one name, Dean Rowe. A letter appeared on his personal page, not long, not poetic, just a few evenly typed lines, but carrying the weight of someone who had touched the truth. I am Dean Rowe, the officer who stood next to Ray Holden on Hawthorne Street. I stayed silent when I saw him turn off the body cam, and I chose not to speak up. I'm sorry. The letter went on to describe sleepless nights, the image of Malcolm Vance standing in the sun, calm as if staring into a mirror that reflected an entire system. He ended with a single line that made millions pause mid-scroll. I once thought silence was neutral, but really it's the easiest way to become complicit. Within hours, the letter spread everywhere. Major news outlets reposted it, each headline with its own tone, but all pointing to the same message: confession shakes law enforcement. Thousands of comments poured in, some praised, some condemned, some cried, but all recognized the truth in every sentence. A few of Dean's former colleagues sent him private messages, some calling him a traitor, others calling it bravery. Public opinion was divided, but for the first time in weeks, the conversation shifted from skin color to responsibility, from rank to conscience. In that noisy sea of voices, Malcolm Vance's name came up again, not with anger this time, but with respect. That afternoon, Malcolm returned to his office, the dark wood desk still coated with a fine layer of dust, a sign he rarely stayed in one place for long. His assistant laid a stack of newspapers in front of him, the front page showing Dean's letter with the headline, "I'm sorry," in bold. He read in silence, his eyes moving slowly line by line, then set the paper down, hands clasped in front of him. The assistant asked quietly, "Do you plan to respond?" Malcolm shook his head, his voice low, almost a breath. The truth knows how to speak for itself. He opened his laptop and typed one sentence into the status box: "Silence is never neutral." That short line spread faster than any official statement. Within hours, it appeared on thousands of websites, printed on magazine covers, shared alongside images of Malcolm standing outside the courthouse, the light catching the badge on his chest like a small flame. People called it the new premise of justice, because it didn't accuse or defend, it made everyone look inward. Amid the noise, someone rewrote it. Silence can save if it's used to listen, but it kills if it's used to avoid. As for Malcolm, after typing the final word, he shut the laptop and sat quietly by the window, looking out at a sky slowly changing color. In the dim light of sunset, his reflection in the glass was calm yet powerful, the presence of someone who understood that sometimes one honest sentence is enough to shift the course of a collective conscience. The large conference room on the 12th floor was locked shut, blinds drawn to block all outside light. On the table sat a thick stack of bound documents, the cover lined with the words "Confidential. Internal Review." Malcolm Vance stood at the head of the table, yellow light casting down on his shoulders, stretching his shadow across the tiled floor. In front of him sat 8 high-ranking officers, each with a different expression, some silent, some avoiding his gaze, one sitting stiff-backed in clear disapproval. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper and the tap of pens on the table. Malcolm opened the file, his voice clear and cold. "I've reviewed all internal reports from the past 10 years. The cases closed due to lack of evidence all share the same pattern, same group of officers, same signature style." He placed 3 enlarged printouts on the table, signatures nearly identical, differing only in minor strokes. This indicates the reports were copied and edited. The room sank into tension. A few glanced at each other. One officer cleared his throat, but no one spoke. Malcolm continued flipping to the second file, eyes stopping on photographs with notes. In 13 cases involving Ray Holden 6 were approved by Lieutenant Green, and 4 others have this same signature pattern. I don't believe that's a coincidence. He paused, locking eyes with an officer seated at the end of the table, once Holden's advisor. That man's face hardened, then snapped out a sentence like stone. "You're destroying the reputation of the force." The room seemed to split down. An invisible line half bowed their heads, the other half gripped their armrests. Malcolm replied slowly, voice steady, not loud, but pressed with weight. "I'm doing my job, and reputation isn't a shield for wrongdoing." The man struck the table lightly, the slap loud enough to knock a few folders open. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one under scrutiny every day." Malcolm looked at him, gaze unshaken. "If a reputation is built on lies, it's not worth keeping." A younger officer sitting nearby cut in his voice, soft but firm. "Mr. Vance is right. We're losing the public's trust." The room shifted again, some cast sharp warning glances. Malcolm walked to the screen, turned on the projector. The display showed a connection map of the cases, red lines tangled like a web. "This is the cover-up structure I uncovered. It began in the former internal review team and spread to the administrative branch. If we don't cut it out, we'll keep repeating this cycle." He paused, scanning the room, then added quietly, "No one here is being accused unless they choose silence." The room fell quiet again. The chief of police, seated at the far end of the table, set his pen down, his voice hoarse but clear. "Do you have verified evidence?" Malcolm gave a slight nod, pulling out a sealed file and placing it in the center of the table. "All signatures have been authenticated by forensics. I don't need justification, only action." The chief's eyes paused on the first page, his lips pressed tight. Outside, rain began tapping against the windows, each drop heavy like the pounding hearts inside the room. The meeting continued in silence, but everyone understood that from this moment on, the reputation they once tried to protect had cracked. And at the head of the table, Malcolm remained standing, the light reflecting off his badge, setting his figure apart like a line drawn between the seeker of truth and those still struggling to defend what had long since decayed. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Everyone seated around the council table remained stiff, eyes locked on the stack of documents before them as if it held something they didn't want to face. A senior officer finally spoke, his tone lower now but still tinged with bitterness. "Do you realize this could damage the entire department's reputation? The public will think we're tearing ourselves apart." Malcolm Vance turned toward him, the screen's glow casting across his face, sharpening the calm but piercing look in his eyes. He spoke slowly, each word measured like a heartbeat. "Reputation isn't a wall, it's a mirror. And when you look into it, you'll see the cracks if you have the courage to look long enough." The words froze the room for a second, forcing the once avoidant eyes to now face him, to face the truth spoken in a tone too calm to ignore and too precise to deny. The objector fell silent, leaned back in his chair, eyes closed as if conceding some part of him had shifted. The chief of police tilted his head slightly, gripping his silver pen, and the light from the window made everything seem to slow. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a heavy tone. "I understand what you're doing, Vance, but are you sure this won't take us all down with it?" Malcolm didn't blink his answer short. "If it takes us down, it means the foundation was already rotten. If it holds, then truth will keep it standing." The chief looked at him for a long moment, then placed the pen on the table. "All right," he said, "bring it to a vote." The room seemed to cool, but the air remained thick. Each person took a ballot, wrote quickly, folded it, and dropped it into the wooden box at the center of the table. The ballots fell with soft sounds like the beginning of rain outside. A staff member stepped forward to count ayes, following every number as it appeared on the display. 6 votes, then 7. It stopped at 7. He looked up, his voice hoarse with tension, 7 out of 9 in favor of a full investigation. In that moment, no one spoke, but everyone understood this was no longer an administrative decision. It was the line between staying silent and standing for what is right. Malcolm bowed his head slightly, a gesture both of gratitude and farewell to the old order he had once been part of. The ceiling light fell across his shoulder, catching the golden badge in a bright gleam, like the last light left among tired faces. The chief remained seated, his voice low but firm. "From now on, we follow procedure. No hiding, no delays," Malcolm replied. "That's all I need." He gathered his documents. The folder's closing snap rang out dry and final, like the start of a new chapter. Outside, the glass rain kept falling, droplets sliding down as if wiping away the dust from the window, and in that moment Malcolm realized he hadn't just broken reputation. He had made it reflect the true light of justice, the one everyone thought they were seeing but had never dared to face. On the set of the national television studio, the lights shone brightly, reflecting off the blue backdrop behind Ray Holden, the man who once represented power, now sitting still in a plain prison uniform. No more police barricades, no flashing red and blue lights, just a single microphone and the eyes of millions watching through their screens. The host spoke briefly, his voice low and firm. "Today we speak of responsibility, not of one man but of an entire system." Then he turned to Holden and gave a nod. Holden bowed his head, hands tightly clasped, his eyes red under the lights. His voice was hoarse, broken, but each word came out clear enough to sink the room into silence. "I once thought the badge protected me," he said, a tear falling down his cheek and soaking into his gray collar, "but I used it as a weapon." A long pause followed. The camera zoomed slowly, closing in on Holden's face, where regret traced every line. He looked up, eyes fixed on the camera, as if speaking more to himself than anyone else. "I believed power meant making others afraid. I forgot fear doesn't create order, it only creates silence. I made those who should have felt protected feel like they had to stay away from me. I betrayed the job I was meant to serve." In the studio, the host sat still, and the crew behind the scenes didn't move. A woman in the audience wiped her tears, and across social media millions of comments began to appear, but no one interrupted Holden. He went on, voice breaking as if crushed from within. "I thought the law was something that protected me, but it turns out it was made to remind me I'm just the one who enforces it, not the one who writes it. I was so afraid of losing power, I forgot power only means something when it's used to serve others." He paused, wiped his face, then delivered the final sentence, his voice low but weighted. "Justice isn't something I held. It was something I stepped on to get ahead of others." A stillness fell. Then the room filled with soft sighs and quiet applause. There were no cheers, no loud reactions, only the stillness of people witnessing what they rarely see on live television, true confession. In the audience row, Malcolm Vance sat quietly, the light casting across his face, his eyes deep but no longer carrying their usual coldness. He looked at Holden for a long time, not with satisfaction or anger, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the moment when that man had finally found the courage to speak the truth. When the program ended, the host thanked the audience, and Holden bowed his head low, his voice breaking. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only want people to understand that when justice is turned into a tool, the one wielding it will be consumed too." He stepped down from the chair, the studio lights fading, and in the last remaining glow, Malcolm still sat there, his face illuminated by a soft halo, a symbol of the kind of silence that listens something justice sometimes needs more than applause. The studio fell still after Ray Holden's final words. The lights remained bright, but the air felt cooler. There were no claps, no remarks. Everything seemed suspended at the edge of emotion. The cameras kept rolling, but those behind them forgot their usual movements, their eyes fixed on the man bowing before the public under the pale white light of a truth just spoken aloud. In the audience, faces reflected a mix of pity and awe. Some teared up, others sat silently, some turned to each other without finding words. That atmosphere lingered thick and unmoving, as if all sound had been pulled into the space between guilt and awakening. Holden stood still, hands clasped in front of him, shoulders trembling slightly, his clouded eyes fixed forward where the microphone was capturing his breath and turning it into a sound echoing across millions of screens. In the distance, Malcolm Vance remained seated in the guest section, his position almost hidden in the dark with only the studio lights faintly catching the gray at his temples. He watched Holden without blinking, his gaze both heavy and lucid. In that moment, no one but him could fully grasp the weight of a truth spoken in public. It wasn't the triumph of one man or the downfall of another, but the moment when justice, after being concealed, began to function again like a natural mechanism. Malcolm gave a slight nod, a gesture nearly unnoticed, but within his eyes was a full confirmation. It wasn't forgiveness, nor was it mercy, but the recognition that moral order had been restored to its rightful place, that the wheel of justice had turned without anyone needing to push it. As the program ended, the lights gradually dimmed and the studio sank into the faint glow left from the audience screens. Holden was escorted out slowly, his head lowered, but his steps no longer trembled like when he arrived. The host stood still, then turned to look at Malcolm, eyes silently questioning, but he said nothing. He simply closed the small notebook on his lap, stood up, and walked out through the narrow hallway. Outside, the night wind swept in, carrying the scent of dew and the light from distant buildings. He stopped, glancing through the glass that reflected the studio behind him where people were clearing up, then quietly said, "Justice doesn't need to be controlled. It knows when to speak." His gaze was calm, neither angry nor triumphant, only tired, with a quiet, lingering sense of belief. In that moment, Malcolm was no longer a supervisor or investigator, but a witness to a rare occasion when a person dared to face their own wrongdoing. And in that still place at the thin edge between guilt and redemption, he understood that justice had been activated not by power, but by the courage of truth spoken aloud. The morning at the federal courthouse opened in the white light of autumn, early sunlight streaming through the tall glass, reflecting off the cold marble floor. The courtroom was packed, the press row, extended microphones neatly arranged before the prosecution table, and behind them citizens gathered in silence, waiting for the moment everyone knew would come. In that space, the judge appeared, his black robe sweeping gently, as his voice rang out slowly with the weight of each word like the striking of a gavel on wood. Charge of unlawful use of force, guilty. The gavel struck the bench with a dry, sharp sound echoing through the ceiling and reverberating in the listeners' chests. No one breathed loudly. Time seemed suspended. At the defendant's bench, Ray Holden stood tall, the light shining through the window, casting over his face, revealing every wrinkle and old bruise. He did not move, nor show emotion, only pressed his lips together, then opened them, his voice small, weary, but clear. "I deserve to be taught how to be human again." The words didn't come out loud, but enough to make the room vibrate like a tense wire being plucked. The judge looked at him for a long moment, his gaze no longer stern but contemplative, the kind of silence that comes from someone who's heard too many empty defenses, but rarely a sentence that strips away all pretense. In the back row, Dean Rowe bowed his head, fingers clutching his notebook, eyes landing on the line he wrote the night before. Truth doesn't redeem it, just opens the door for those willing to walk through. Overhead light fell across the right aisle, where Malcolm Vance sat, his purple suit distinct among the darker rows. He looked at Holden, his face no longer cold, but quietly composed, like someone who understands that justice doesn't always satisfy. Sometimes it only leaves behind a wound that's been stitched shut. The judge continued, the sentencing voice steady and firm. "Ray Holden is hereby sentenced 20 years in prison with mandatory rehabilitative supervision. The court acknowledges his cooperative attitude and assistance with the investigation." Camera shutters click continuously, flashes fill in the room, but Holden remained still, bowing his head slightly as if accepting a verdict not upon his body, but upon a self that had been corrupted. A few in the gallery clapped softly, not out of joy, but in heavy recognition that justice had done its part. Malcolm rose, adjusted his collar, his gaze passing over Holden with a single nod. No words were needed at that moment. Silence carried more weight than anything they could have said. As the court adjourned, the crowd poured into the hallway, the sound of conversation mixing with hurried footsteps. Dean passed by. Malcolm paused for a moment and said quietly, "Maybe you were right. Justice doesn't judge, it just reminds." Malcolm gave a faint smile, responding only with a calm look. Outside, the light had grown brighter, sunlight streaming straight through the window, casting a long beam across the floor like a road newly opened after months of shadow. And in that light, each person leaving the courthouse carried a different feeling, but all understood that this morning wasn't just the sentencing of one man, it was the first dawn of a justice system learning how to be human again. As the crowd began to exit the courtroom, Dean Rowe remained still among the rows of seats, his eyes following Holden as he was led down the hallway. That sight felt like the final period closing the years he had carried silence on his back. In Dean's hand was the handwritten resignation letter he had prepared the night before, folded neatly in his coat pocket. Stepping out of the courthouse, he walked to the Internal Affairs office, handed the letter to the clerk, his voice low and firm. "I'm resigning. I need to relearn what justice means." The clerk looked at him, surprise mixed with respect, asked nothing, and simply nodded. Dean walked outside the morning breeze, brushing his hair, carrying in a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, he felt himself walking without fear. On a stone bench near the gate, he opened his phone and looked at the law school application he had submitted weeks earlier. Under the words, "Application accepted," his lips curved into a small smile. Across the street, Malcolm Vance stepped out of the courthouse's large front doors, the sound of his shoes steady on the stone steps, flanked by rows of reporters waiting. He didn't stop or respond to any questions, just walked slowly toward the light at the gate. The sky was crystal clear that day, sunlight falling in golden stripes, catching the round badge on his chest and making it gleam like freshly polished metal. Every step he took drew different reactions. Some nodded, some averted their eyes, some simply watched in silence. But for Malcolm, all the noise seemed to fade away, leaving only the wind and the heavy sense that a long chapter of justice had just come to a close. He paused briefly at the bottom step, turning to glance back at the building behind him, its white walls still reflecting the sun. In that moment, Malcolm wasn't thinking of victory or loss, but of the people changed by this journey, a man who abused power, learning humility, a once silent officer choosing to speak, and himself someone who had come to understand that justice isn't a destination, but a path to be walked every day. The light hit his face, making the badge on his chest shine even brighter, like a symbol of belief freshly wiped clean after being buried in dust for so long. He stepped off the final stair and into the flow of people on the street, his expression calm, but in his eyes burned a quiet fire, the light of someone who believes that justice, no matter how late, always knows how to find its way back. The city's press room blazed with lights and camera lenses pointed at the main stage. A large banner hung across the back wall, the bold words, "Accountability Act" sign. Standing out against a blue background, a clear statement that a new chapter had begun. Camera shutters clicked non-stop as the mayor stepped up to the podium, his face marked by both solemnity and relief. "Starting today," he said, his voice steady through the speakers, "all officers on duty will be required to keep their body cameras on at all times. No more exception. Anyone who turns them off, tampers with, or alters the footage will be held accountable under the law." The declaration echoed through the room like a strong wind, sweeping away years of cover-ups and silence. Reporters lowered their heads to take notes while attending citizens nodded in agreement. Under the bright lights, a few young officers seated in the front row clenched their hands quietly, their eyes not fearful but holding a flicker of hope that something better was beginning. After the speech, the mayor introduced a name that stirred the room. Overseeing the enforcement of this new law, Director of Internal Oversight Mr. Malcolm Vance. Applause broke out, evenly interrupted by camera flashes. Malcolm walked up to the podium, his stance steady, the familiar purple suit catching the light in a tone of solemn dignity. He stood silently for a moment, letting the room settle, then spoke briefly, each word firm, though his tone stayed calm. This law wasn't made to control anyone, but to protect everyone. A camera doesn't replace a conscience, but it reminds us to live truthfully with the duty we swore to uphold. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room where reporters waited to capture every word. No one is forced to be good, but from today on, no one is allowed to pretend. A wave of silence spread, then turned into steady applause, not loud, but relentless, as if everyone had just heard what they had long waited for. At the back of the room, Dean Rowe, now a first-year law student, sat quietly, eyes fixed on Malcolm, a small smile forming on his lips. He understood that the path they once began on a hot, dusty afternoon had now reached a moment of renewal. Malcolm looked toward the front row and saw young officers nodding, some placing their hands over their badges, and in that light he recognized the image of a new generation rising from the wounds of the old. As the meeting ended, the mayor shook Malcolm's hand and said quietly, "You made this city believe in itself again." Malcolm smiled, responding with a calm gaze. He turned toward the cameras, the lights reflecting off the golden badge on his chest shining brightly beneath the banner as a reminder of why he was still there. Outside the windows, sunlight filtered through the tall buildings, and the city seemed more at peace. In that moment, Malcolm knew that every battle might begin with a small fracture, but could only be healed by one thing: honesty. A young reporter stood up from the middle row, raising her hand amid the crowd's murmur. She looked about 25, her brown hair tied high, holding her mic with a mix of nervousness and resolve. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice echoing through the speakers, "after everything that's happened, after the new law passed, after becoming the face of reform, do you feel proud?" The question seemed simple, but in that moment the entire room went still. Cameras turned toward Malcolm, lights flared against his face, making the badge on his chest shine even brighter than the stage itself. He looked at the reporter, a faint smile crossed his lips, not polite, but reassuring. Then he replied slowly, his voice steady and measured like the rhythm of a fair verdict. "Pride doesn't save anyone. Action does." That line dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples through the silence. Hundreds seated across the hall glanced at one another. Some bowed their heads. Others pressed their lips tight, but no one spoke. Malcolm didn't look around. Continued, "I've seen too many grow complacent, believing justice was on their side, and others fall into despair, thinking justice had left them behind. But justice doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to action. Every day we choose to do what's right. No matter how small is a day, we keep it alive." His voice never rose, never strained, but each word landed with a weight that left no room for doubt. The reporter bowed slightly in thanks, and around the room the sounds of pens tapping shutters, clicking, and soft exhales blended into a vivid soundscape of awakening. The mayor, seated in the front row, gave a slight nod, his eyes reflecting genuine respect. "Thank you, Vance," he said softly, almost a whisper. "That's the answer the younger generation needed to hear." Malcolm turned to him, responding with a faint smile. Behind him, the Accountability Act signed banner still hung, glowing under the lights, a reminder to everyone that justice is not the end point, but the beginning of a new responsibility. He stepped down from the podium, walked along the row of seats, the camera followed closely, and with each step, the lights caught the golden badge on his chest like a small flame, steady, not blazing, but unyielding. Outside, the city stirred back to life after the rain the night before. At the steps of City Hall, a group of students stood holding a sign that read, "Be better than yesterday." The words, written in shaky white chalk but full of conviction. Malcolm paused, smiled, nodded gently, then continued walking into the morning sunlight. In that moment, all the applause, all the praise faded away, leaving only one thought echoing in his mind, that justice does not live through the voice of the crowd, but through the actions of each person brave enough to step forward. The crisp morning light streamed through the large windows of the new police academy, sunlight spilling onto rows of polished wooden seats where dozens of young cadets sat upright, uniforms, still new eyes, still full of resolve. At the front of the room, Malcolm Vance walked in wearing a simple white shirt, the gold badge pinned to his left chest catching the morning light, not sparkling as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of a past marked by enough loss to understand the true weight of justice. He placed a folder on the desk, looked around the room, his gaze quiet but deep, then spoke slowly, each word clear. "Every time you wear this badge, remember it's not power, it's responsibility." His words spread gently but wide, like ripples moving across a still lake. The cadets looked at him, some nodded, some took a deep breath. One in the front row clenched his fist as if something beyond training had just clicked. Malcolm continued stepping closer to the front row, his voice low and steady. "This badge isn't meant to make people fear you. It's meant to make them trust you. And when that trust is broken, the law can't fix it. Only people can." He looked up toward the back row, where sunlight poured through the window, catching the dust in the air like tiny golden particles. A cadet raised his hand, young face uncertain but sincere. "What if our superior is wrong, sir?" The room went still. Pens stopped mid-note. All eyes turned toward the one who asked. Malcolm stood quietly for a moment, the light falling across his face, reflecting the classroom back through his eyes. He smiled, soft but firm, then replied, "If your superior is wrong, you don't bow your head, but you also don't rebel. You stand your ground, because justice doesn't live in orders. It lives in each person's choices." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Some cadets glanced at one another, their expressions a mix of admiration and reflection. Malcolm returned to the desk, picked up a marker, and wrote the word responsibility on the board in bold, deliberate strokes, then said, "Out there, you'll meet people wearing the same uniform who live in ways that betray the oath. When you do remember, they don't represent the force. They represent their own failure. Your job is to prove that justice still exists in this uniform." A wave of silence swept through the room, as if each person was holding up a mirror to themselves through those words. The bell, signaling the end of a class, rang, but no one moved. Malcolm looked around and saw the young eyes burning with the same conviction he once carried, and for the first time in years he smiled genuinely. As he stepped out of the room, the sun was high, reflecting off the sign behind him where the words Justice Academy gleamed bright. In that moment, Malcolm understood that what he had fought for didn't end in a courtroom or a chamber, but continued to live in the eyes watching him today. Eyes learning that justice begins with the courage to speak the truth and do the right thing even when no one stands with you. The classroom remained silent after Malcolm's answer. No one took notes. No one spoke. Only the morning light slipped through the window, casting a glow on the front row where young faces looked at him with complete focus. He walked slowly around the room, his shoes making a soft sound against the polished floor, then stopped in front of the cadet who had asked the question. His expression wasn't stern, but calm, as if he were about to say the most important thing of the day. He placed a hand on the desk, his voice low but firm. "If your superior is wrong, turn on the camera and look straight ahead." The words came out soft but sharp, like a line of light drawn through the dark. The room seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was a pen clattering to the floor. Malcolm lifted his head and continued. When you look straight ahead, you're not standing against anyone, you're standing with the truth. All power fears light because light chooses no side. A long pause followed, then suddenly applause broke out from the corner of the room. A young cadet stood up, eyes shining, clapping with a force that seemed impossible to hold back. Instantly, dozens of others joined in, hands rising together, the sound echoing through the wide room, bouncing off the ceiling, spilling out into the hallway. Malcolm stood still, his eyes quietly taking in the faces lit up by conviction. His expression didn't shift much, but at the corner of his mouth was a narrow, steady smile, the smile of someone who had just seen justice take root in new ground. He motioned for the class to settle, and as the applause slowly faded, he spoke again, softer now, but every word still clear. Sometimes courage isn't loud, it's turning the camera on when someone else wants you to turn it off. The morning light slanted through the window, shining directly onto the blackboard behind where the slogan, "Truth has rank," was boldly painted in white. Dust particles in the air sparkled in the beam of light, creating a quiet, almost sacred atmosphere. Malcolm stared at those words for a long moment, as if re-examining his own belief after years of watching justice stained, then washed clean by blood, by tears, by the persistence of those who refused to stay silent. He turned back to the class light, catching his shoulder, and his voice lowered, carrying a rare warmth. "You will fail, you will fall, you will grow tired, but don't forget, truth has a rank of its own. It doesn't need a title, it just needs to be seen." The bell, signaling the end of class, rang, but no one stood. Everyone remained facing the glowing blackboard where the words "Truth has rank" seemed etched in sunlight. Malcolm picked up his folder and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to look at the classroom one last time. In that light, he saw young eyes, steady and clear, like shards of mirrors, all reflecting the same thing, that truth had begun to speak in its own voice, and this time it was being passed on to those brave enough to keep it shining. Night fell, and the city outside sank into dim yellow lights, the empty streets carrying only the soft sound of wind brushing through the trees. In a small office, Malcolm Vance sat at his desk, a warm desk lamp casting light over a blank sheet of paper. In front of him lay a half-written letter, its top corner marked with the words, "To the father who was once humiliated for sharing my skin." He set the pen down, staring at that line for a long time, not looking outward but through time itself. Through the years he had grown up watching a silent father endure a world not yet ready to acknowledge fairness. Memories surged back, the heavy footsteps of officers on wooden steps, the slam of doors, the quiet sighs he used to hear when his father returned from court, tired eyes. Malcolm took a deep breath, lifted his pen, and wrote with a faint trembling hand, like a confession that needed no reply, "I'm not seeking revenge. I'm finishing what you couldn't." He paused, eyes drifting toward the window where the city lights reflected on the glass in a web of overlapping streaks. Outside, a patrol car passed by, its red and blue lights sweeping across the room, briefly illuminating his face. Malcolm smiled softly, the smile of someone who had finally spoken what had long lived buried inside. He kept writing, his voice whispering in the rhythm with the pen, "I don't want to see anyone bow their head again, not even those who once brought you to your knees. I want them to understand justice isn't a gift to be given. It's a duty to be upheld. You taught me to stand tall, and I still do, no matter how many times this world has tried to knock me down." The night wind drifted through the window, rustling the paper slightly. Malcolm closed his eyes, letting the quiet sounds of the night fill his mind. He remembered that afternoon when the reform law passed, when young officers stood and applauded, and in their faces he saw his father's dream of a generation unafraid to speak the truth. His pen pressed firmer, now more certain. I wish you could have seen today when a young officer turned on his camera instead of lowering his head when they learned to face the light. instead of avoiding it. Maybe you're no longer here, but you planted the seed and I am only watering it. He stopped writing, looked at the letter one last time, then folded it and slipped it into an unmarked envelope. On the desk, his father's old badge still lay there, its dull metal catching the light. Malcolm gently placed the envelope beside it, his hand resting for a moment as if offering a quiet greeting to someone who had never really left. Outside, the clock struck midnight. The room's light slowly faded, leaving only the slightly open window where the wind flipped the page, still drying with ink. And in that wind, there seemed to be a whisper. His father's voice joined with his own, repeating the old truth. Justice, even when late, is the greatest legacy a person can leave behind. Outside, the sky seemed to be settling, the first small drops of rain tapping against the window pane, forming fine thread-like trails. That steady patter echoed gently, blending with the quiet rhythm of Malcolm Vance's breath as he set his pen down after the final line. The rain fell lightly but persistently, each drop catching the warm light from the room, casting a soft glow on his face and giving the scene a sense of both sorrow and peace. He sat still for a while, eyes following the raindrops as they slid down, met, then parted again, like the diverging paths of people on the journey toward justice. In the quiet sounds of the night, the rain felt like the past whispering, reminding him of what had once been, buried deep of wounds thought to be healed, that still left scars beneath the skin. Malcolm picked up the letter he had just written, reading each line again, his eyes moving slowly over the ink that had begun to dry. Every sentence, every word carried the breath of a life shaped by too much silence, a life that had chosen to confront rather than retreat. He gave a slight nod as if to affirm that these words didn't need to be understood by anyone else because they had been spoken to the one who needed them most. The rain thickened outside, streaming down the glass in long trails, then breaking apart, blurring together like memories no longer held in separate boxes. In the dim light, Malcolm folded the letter carefully, each motion slow and deliberate, as if he were closing off a quiet part of his heart. He opened a drawer, revealing a few old photos, some notes from past cases, and the worn silver badge, his father's faded at the edges, the only keepsake he had held on to since childhood. He placed the letter on top of everything, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper, then shut the drawer gently, the soft click sounding like the final period of a long chapter. He whispered, his voice nearly lost in the sound of the rain. No need to send it, just remember. His eyes closed and a faint smile appeared, one filled with the kind of peace he hadn't felt in a very long time. In that moment, the rain outside became a soundtrack to the late hour. The desk lamp's glow reflected on the glass, casting his silhouette over the misty cityscape beyond. Malcolm stood, walked to the window, his hand resting lightly against the cool pane. He looked out, seeing the rain-slick streets, the headlights of cars stretched into long streaks blurred like a dream fading away. In his mind, the letter was no longer a message to the past, but a promise to the future, a reminder that justice doesn't live in the sound of cheers, but in the memory of those who choose to remember, so mistakes are not repeated. When he turned off the light, only the rain remained, falling steadily like the rhythm of time, like a gentle confirmation that one chapter had closed, but what was written tonight would remain carried forward in the light of memory. That morning, the city sky was unusually clear, the sunlight pouring down on the newly inaugurated square where citizens had gathered early to witness a historic moment they had all helped create. At the center of the square stood a bronze statue on a pale stone platform, Malcolm Vance's face carved with calm dignity, his eyes looking far ahead as if gazing through time and into the generations to come. His right hand held a golden badge raised at chest height, his left hand resting gently by his side, a symbol of courage not born of force, but of conviction. The statue carried no weapon, no aura of power, only the quiet strength of dignity held firm in the storm. At the base, words etched deep into the stone made all who passed enforced stop and read, they enforced silence. He enforced truth. Music from the brass band rose slowly, each note blending with the wind rustling through rows of flags. The mayor spoke briefly, his voice low, pausing on each word as if pressing them into memory. "We are not raising a statue to a hero, but to a man who honored his oath. This monument does not commemorate victory. It commemorates honesty." In the crowd below, faces of all colors looked up. Some had once opposed others, once doubted, but now all were quiet, realizing truth doesn't need defenders, only proof. Among the crowd, Dean Rowe, now a practicing attorney, stood holding a bouquet of white flowers. He stepped up a few stone steps, laid the bouquet at the foot of the statue, and let his eyes rest on the words carved in stone. He enforced truth. The short sentence held the weight of generations of those who had learned that justice is not a shout, but the quiet act of those willing to be accountable for their choices. Dean stepped back, glancing around, seeing young police cadets taking photos by the statue, a few of them raising their badges high as if answering the call of that legacy. When the covering fell completely, sunlight struck the statue's face, making the badge in Malcolm's hand gleam as if gilded. A child ran up, tugged at his mother's hand, and asked quietly, "Mom, why isn't he holding a gun?" The mother smiled, leaned down, and answered, "Because he knew justice doesn't need weapons to be strong." That simple reply made others nearby turn and smile too. Overhead, a flock of birds flew across the sky, their shadows passing over the statue's face in a moment that seemed to pause time. In that brilliant light, Malcolm's bronze features seemed almost alive, almost smiling quietly, reminding all that truth never dies. It is carved into the city's memory, into the eyes of those who still believe that silence can be enforced but justice cannot. That afternoon, with the sun high above the square, glowed under golden light reflecting off the statue's face and making the bronze shine brightly against the sky. The line of visitors stretched long, quiet, and unhurried, each carrying a natural sense of reverence, as if they weren't merely standing before a monument, but before a witness silently watching them grow with time. Toward the front, a group of middle school children, led by their teachers, gathered for a visit, holding small flags and chatting excitedly. A curly-haired girl raised her camera and said to her friend with eager delight, "Look, he's wearing the purple suit like it's in the history books." The other children burst out laughing, then lined up for photos together. Behind them, light shining through the statue cast a soft purple hue that blended with the sunlit square, as if that suit had never faded, but still lived on in the city's memory. A young boy stood still for a while after the photo, gazing up at Malcolm's bronze face, his clear eyes catching the sunlight. He softly asked his teacher, "Miss, why isn't he smiling?" The teacher smiled, leaned down, and whispered, "Because he's watching to see if we're living up to what he believed in." The boy nodded, his eyes suddenly serious, then turned back to face the camera, folding his arms and mimicking the statue's pose, right hand over his chest, left hand resting by his side, eyes looking straight ahead. The group erupted in laughter, but when the photo appeared on the screen, everyone fell quiet for a moment. In that image under the midday sun, the boy's face and the statues seemed to merge two generations connected by an invisible thread, the quiet continuation of faith in justice, simple and enduring. The narrator stood at the edge of the square, eyes following the scene where past and present coexisted in a rare moment. Children's laughter echoed between the breeze footsteps and camera clicks, creating a gentle harmony for a city awakening after many seasons of storms. Everything around the statue seemed to carry its own life. Each paving stone, each cluster of flowers, each passer-by reflecting the light of a trust that had been rebuilt. The narrator's voice rose barely above a whisper, as if carried by the wind. "Justice doesn't shout, it watches." The words didn't ring loud, but they drifted across the square, touching those who had paused, lifting their eyes once more to the statue. Because in that light, everyone saw themselves reflected not through the eyes of a hero, but through the gaze of truth. And as the children laughed and ran around the statue, the sunlight continued to fall, glinting off the shimmering purple suit, a soft reminder that some things don't need to be shouted, only seen and believed. Dawn cast a thin layer of mist over the city, the first light of day, as soft as breath, spreading gently across streets just waking up. Hawthorne. The street once at the heart of so much upheaval was now eerily calm. The pavement was spotless, trees on either side bowed gently in the morning breeze, and coffee shops were beginning to open, the scent of roasted beans blending with the wind to create that familiar smell of a complete morning. Malcolm Vance walked slowly along the sidewalk, his purple suit catching the sunlight, not a symbol of power anymore, but a mark of a journey that had come to a close. Each step he took brushed against old memories, once tense and sharp, now softened like a river flushing instead at oof after the storm. When he stopped at the familiar corner where arguments once echoed, the sun glinted off the window of a patrol car parked nearby, making him squint as a feeling he couldn't name passed through him, something both familiar and distant. The patrol car gleamed with new plates and the words Internal Integrity Division printed on its side. A young officer sat behind the wheel about to start the engine when he noticed Malcolm. He immediately opened the door and stepped out, his shoes landing softly on the pavement, a flicker of a smile crossing his face. As he approached, the angled light caught his badge, its shine nearly matching the old one Malcolm used to wear. The officer bowed his head in greeting, the movement swift, not weighed down by formality, but filled with sincerity. Malcolm stopped, nodded in return, his gaze calm, deep, and warm. That moment needed no words because both men understood they were standing on the same ground where justice was no longer a slogan but a living force carried by the acts of ordinary people. The young officer spoke softly, a touch of emotion in his voice. I trained at the academy when you taught the first class. I still remember what you said. When a superior is wrong, turn on your camera and face forward. Malcolm smiled, replying simply, and have you done it yet? The officer laughed, his eyes bright in the sun. I'm trying every day. That quiet answer made Malcolm bow his head slightly, his smile no longer the smile of a man who had endured every high and low, but of someone watching new growth rise from scorched earth. He placed a hand on the officer's shoulder and said gently, "That's enough." They stood side by side, watching people begin to fill the street car horns echoing in the distance, sunlight spilling across the road and lighting up the freshly replaced Hawthorne Street sign. Malcolm looked up at the sign, and somewhere inside him the sounds of the past stirred footsteps, whined the echoes of a day that had redefined justice. He turned and walked on, his shadow stretching across the street, merging with the soft golden light of morning. Behind him, the officer stayed where he was watching, not calling out, simply standing tall with one hand resting on the badge over his heart. In the gentle light, two generations met at an old street corner, one who had fulfilled his mission and one just beginning. And in that moment, the city itself seemed to exhale as if bowing to justice, not something that ever grows old, but something that simply changes hands to keep on living. Early light spread across Hawthorne Street, casting a soft golden hue over the old brick buildings, as if the entire space were covered in a gentle glow. Malcolm Vance paused at the intersection, the breeze carrying the scent of coffee and birdsong woven into the rhythm of a city just waking up. He turned to look at the young officer, his gaze kind but deep, then smiled a thin, quiet smile that said everything he didn't need to voice. The golden light reflected off the badge on his chest, making it glow against the pale purple of his suit, not with a blinding brilliance, but with the warmth of a lantern illuminating the past and casting light toward the future. In that moment, everything around them seemed to pause, time itself appearing to revisit its beginning, watching two people, one representing what had been proven, the other what was about to be continued, standing in the middle of a street once filled with silence and longing. Malcolm gave a slight nod, his voice slow and steady. "You know, sometimes justice doesn't need someone to speak loudly for it. It just needs someone to keep acting." The young officer said nothing, a faint smile appearing as if he had just been handed a thread to continue what he'd been searching for. He saluted Malcolm again, then returned to his car, the door shutting with a soft sound that blended into the calm breath of the morning. Malcolm watched him go, his eyes carrying a lightness like someone who had finally set down a burden that no longer belonged to him. He looked up the clear sky above, reflecting off the building windows, brightening the street as each ray of sunlight seemed to remind him that what he had done was never wasted. He kept walking, his shoes brushing lightly against the damp pavement, his shadow stretching forward. A few pedestrians passed by, a group of school children crossed the street, and an elderly woman smiled in greeting when she recognized him. Malcolm nodded back, then continued on, an unfamiliar sound rising in his chest. Not the noise of the city, but the quiet heartbeat of a faith growing stronger each day. He stopped in front of a small corner shop. Its old sign freshly replaced the words, "Respect is the law," still there, untouched by time. He smiled a smile just enough to stay in the city's memory, then turned onto a narrow street behind the shop where the last light of dawn fell on his shoulder, soft as a farewell. The wind drifted by, carrying the soft chime of a wind bell hanging from the eaves. A child watched the figure walking away and asked his mother, "Who is he, Mom?" The woman replied gently, her eyes still fixed on the light. "He's the one who taught justice how to exist." The sky brightened, then sunlight touching every window pane, every tree, every damp stretch of pavement. And in the middle of that quiet moment, the final word seemed to appear in the wind, fading but still clear in the city's memory. Justice doesn't scream, it acts. The morning on Hawthorne Street returned to its usual rhythm, where once it had witnessed a confrontation that changed the entire city. The story of Malcolm Vance spread beyond the boundaries of one incident, becoming a symbol of what justice can truly reach when guided by courage and honesty. From the moment he was insulted in the street to the body cam being switched off to the video going viral online, everything that seemed like a personal clash became a wake-up call for an entire system. What began in arrogance and bias ended in acknowledgement and change, as the city chose to rebuild its foundation with reform, with education, with truth taught from the ground up. Malcolm never became a hero on posters, but a mirror for everyone to see themselves more clearly. He didn't strike back with fists, but with quiet actions that made an entire society pauses to reflect. Dean Rowe, once silent, found the strength to speak up, to restart on the path of law, reminding us that courage isn't defeating others, but overcoming our own fear. Holden, in the final courtroom, shed tears and realized that power alone doesn't make someone right. Only responsibility earns someone the name of citizen in the eyes of justice. The city changed, not because of a single law, but because one man acted to make that law mean something. When the statue of Malcolm was raised in the center of the square, his hand holding a badge instead of a gun, the people stood in silence, understanding that truth does not need noise to be remembered. Children came to take pictures. The purple suit became a symbol of integrity, and the words carved at the base of the statue, they enforced silence. He enforced truth became a line repeated in ethics classes. Over time, the story was no longer just that of a single city, but a testament to any place where someone dares to face mistakes in order to correct them. In his later years, Malcolm still walked the old streets, seeing young officers nod in respect, not for rank, but for what he represented. His journey ended in peace, but its impact continued to spread across generations, people who understood that justice is not a judgment from above, but the right action taken in the smallest moments of everyday life. The lesson left behind by the story is simple, yet profound. Reputation may fade, power may be lost, but dignity and truth do not. And when the last light of the day shone on the golden badge on Malcolm's chest, the city seemed to exhale, having come to understand that justice doesn't scream, it acts. Justice does not need to shout. It lives in the way people choose to act, so that what is right can always be seen.